kind of fitting that Vince and I gather here to talk because I met Vince here at the library. How long ago was that? Just over a year? Yeah, up in the top floor of the garden there, which Vince didn't know existed. And he was telling me about working on this book. So here we are again. It's good to see you. This is such a timely book. And I don't think you might not have foreseen everything that's happening around critical minerals that is happening now. But I wonder if we should just start off with some definitions. What are critical minerals?
Yeah, so basically it's the list. It's this basket of metals that we need for renewable energy, for manufacturing, solar panels, wind turbines, and electric cars, the batteries, the motors, everything that goes into them, and all of our digital tech, like Jorge said. It's basically this sort of basket of metals. You've probably heard of some of them: lithium, cobalt, nickel. And also there's a group of them called rare earths, which is, what Trump is after in Greenland and in the Ukraine. And the nutshell is because, we are, however fitfully, shifting into renewable energy, and the world is shifting towards electric vehicles. And of course, we're using more and more digital gear all the time. So there's a massive scramble on all over the world to get more and more and more of these metals. So it's a multi-billion-dollar hunt that's happening all over the world right now.
There is one more definition I want to hear from you, and that is rare earths. What the heck is that?
Yeah, so this is something that confuses a lot of people. Rare earths are a subset of critical metals. Rare earths are a group of 17 super obscure, weird metals with names like neodymium and praseodymium and yttrium, these like hard to pronounce things. And they're only used in very, very small amounts, but they are super important. So they're used for things like electric vehicle motors run on rare earths. Wind turbines also have big rare earth motors in them. And also for all these like super niche but really important applications, like when you see the color red in your iPhone screen, that's because there are tiny little bits of a metal called europium. That's what makes the color red. No europium, no red in your cell phone. Very strange. The thing that makes your cell phone vibrate when you get a call, that's another rare earth metal. So they're kind of like yeast in dough, or like the pepper in a meatball. They're just used in very, very small amounts, but they have big impacts. So they're extremely valuable and much needed for, as I say, for everything that we're talking about: electric vehicles, renewable energy, and all of our digital tech.
So my iPhone's on the table here. How many of those things, earths, minerals, metals, would be in that phone?
There's about 60 different metals in your phone, wow. Believe it or not. Yeah.
And I've heard that there's gold in our phone.
There's gold in your phone, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. So gold doesn't usually make the list, but gold is a really good electrical conductor. So there's little bits of gold in, again, almost all of our digital gadgets, in your phones, in your laptops, everything like that. And it's mostly used just to help sort of move electricity around.
Okay, so you've given us an outline of what these are. And we know that rare earths are in Ukraine, but where are these others found?
Okay, so now we get to the ugly stuff. So these metals, they're found in lots of places, but a lot of them are concentrated in just a few places. So, and as a result of that, there are some big problems. There's some massive environmental damage that is happening as a result of our need for all these metals. So the world's biggest, so nickel is another metal that's used in almost all of our batteries, electric vehicles, and gadgets. And the world's top producer of nickel is Indonesia. That's just happened in the last 20 years because there's so much more demand for nickel now. Hundreds of miles of rainforest in Indonesia have been bulldozed to get at the nickel that's down there. There's another one, cobalt is another thing that's another battery ingredient. 70% of all the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo in the middle of Africa, and thousands of children are working in the mines there. So some of these things are super concentrated. I mean, a lot of them actually are, we have a lot of them here in Canada, And we do mine a fair bit of quite a few of them. You know, we tend to have, you know, thankfully we do have, you know, higher environmental standards, like more stricter environmental regulations, but there's also a whole lot of harm that's come historically with mining for things like copper and nickel, and now actually rare earths here in Canada.
And we're going to come back to that, but I just want to sort of set all of this up because, as you alluded to, we're in the midst of a geopolitical struggle over this and a shifting of balance of power, which was predicted some time ago. But there's one country that is way ahead on all of this, and that is China. How did they get there? How did they become the world leader in both obtaining and refining the metals?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, yeah, not only do China basically dominates the whole supply chain of these metals from the mine to the actual finished product. So they have a lot of metals within their own borders, especially rare earths. Rare earths, they control something like 90% of the whole world's supply. They have a lot within their own borders. They've also, Chinese companies own mines or stakes in mines all over the world, including here in Canada. And also, what's kind of even more important is no matter where that stuff comes out of the ground, most of it gets sent to China for processing, right? To take that raw ore and turn it into pure metal. And then once you've got the pure metal, Chinese companies take those metals and turn them into most of the world's solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and electric vehicles. So every step of the way, China dominates. And how did they get there? It's kind of a combination of them, first of all, being smart, being very foresighted. I mean, as far back as the 90s, the Chinese leadership saw this coming, and actually the Chinese premier at the time said, has this famous quote where he said, you know, the Middle East has oil, we have rare earths. This is all the way back in the 90s. They saw what was coming and started to really make moves to capitalize on it. The other piece of it is, you know, the Western world, especially the United States, basically handed this to them. I mean, what happened is, you know, the United States used to be the world's #1 mining power, but they basically got tired of it. Same story in Canada. Like, you know, we just didn't want all the mining's really ugly, right? It causes a lot of environmental destruction, displacement of indigenous people, all this bad stuff. And we basically said, come around the 70s, 80s, we were like, we don't want to do this in our country anymore. Let's offshore it, like we were doing with all of our other heavy industries. Let the dirty stuff happen in some other country, and we'll just import the finished products. And right around that time is when China was opening themselves up to the world economy, and they said, hey, you guys don't want this stuff? We'll take it.
And what year are we talking about then when that happened?
We're talking
roughly?
like the 80s through into the 90s. And literally a bunch of like refineries, mines, packed up shop from the United States and moved their operations over to China or sold their technology to China. So ever since then, you know, China has just grown and grown and grown and grown, you know, in general, and also especially on this front. So now they have a serious, serious geopolitical advantage, and that brings us back to the Ukraine and to Greenland. That's exactly why the Americans are so eager to get their hands on sources of critical metals that are outside of China's control.
But is China so far ahead that the lead and the power that comes with that, is that insurmountable?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, it sort of varies by metal and by industry. They've got a real lock on some things. But, you know, basically what happened is for about the last 15 years, the whole Western world, US, Canada, Europe, Japan, has sort of woken up to this and realized like, whoa, we've got a real problem here. China's really got us over a barrel, and they've been pouring money into trying to build up supplies, like, you know, to build up sort of a Western supply chain. So, I mean, for instance, there's a lot of money, a lot of investment in Canada going into critical metals. There was a lot going into it in the U.S. And we have been sort of eating into China's lead. They're definitely way out front when it comes to the manufacturing side of things. I mean, especially electric vehicles. So, I don't, you know, I don't think the world is going to wean itself off of dependence on China, but I think we can lessen that dependence, which would be a good thing, if you ask me.
And again, that is why we're seeing someone like Trump push to get his hands on as much as he can, but he's not alone in that. Where's Canada in this competition?
Yeah, so Canada's playing a really big role. I mean, first of all, we do a lot of mining in this country still, and Canadian mining companies are super active all over the world. I mean, one of the biggest, so copper is another metal that we need for the energy transition. Copper is basically what carries that electricity from all those solar fields and the wind farms. It's copper cables that transport that energy, right? It's what the grid is made out of. And Canadian companies have opened up a huge new copper mine just in the last couple of years in the Congo again. Massive new copper mine there. There's Canadian companies that are active in Panama, digging up copper all over the world. There's Canadian companies doing stuff. And like I said, there's also a lot more investment coming into Canada and a lot more, a lot of provinces and jurisdictions are sort of trying to, make it easier for mining to happen here because they see that there's this huge market that's happening for it.
But that's the conflict, isn't it? I mean, I think one of the things about China is that they either had or they may still have less strict environmental regulations around this kind of activity, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And Canada, as you mentioned, in the United States, have developed stricter regimes over the years. And also, First Nations have had a say, especially here in British Columbia, about all of that. So we hear talk nowadays from the federal government about trying to push these projects ahead. Are First Nations, is the environment going to suffer in this race?
So short answer is yes, for sure, because mining always causes some damage. There's no getting around that, right? That's the whole object of it, right, is to literally tear up the earth and dig up what's underneath. So some damage is absolutely inevitable, but, at the same time, we need these metals, right? The biggest threat we face is climate change. So we've absolutely got to stop burning fossil fuels and shift to electric vehicles and renewable energy. We can't do it without getting our hands on more metals. So there's going to be some harm. The question is, how can we keep that harm to a minimum, right?
Do you think that that's being recognized, keeping that harm to a minimum?
Well, I think that, one of Canada's selling points on that front is that we do a better job. Not that it does cause damage, but it's less damage. The standards are higher than they are in a place like Indonesia or China or the Philippines, where we're currently getting a lot of these metals. Not only environmental harm, but also in terms of Indigenous involvement with it, right? Here in Canada, there's no getting around First Nations anymore. If you want to open a big mining project, any kind of big project, you have got to get buy-in from whatever Indigenous communities are living nearby, which is definitely not the case in a lot of other places. So, in the past, really what happened is First Nations just got screwed, right? You'd find copper somewhere, you'd just shove whoever was living there aside, dig up the copper. Nowadays, if you'd want to open up a mine or a smelter or a refinery, you've got to get buy-in from Indigenous communities. And a lot of times they're very willing, much more willing than I realized before I started doing this work on this book. There's a lot of projects that are happening, big projects that are happening with Indigenous involvement. In fact, there's an Indigenous-owned rare earth mine that just started up in either the Yukon or the Northwest Territories. So again, it's not great, it's not pretty, but I do think there's an argument to be made for allowing some more mining to happen here, because it's got to happen somewhere, and it's not okay to just say, ugh, I don't want it in my backyard, let it happen in the Philippines or somewhere.
Then you get into these situations where you've got two competing interests when it comes to climate, and I'm thinking of, I believe it's called the Golden Horseshoe in Ontario, where Doug Ford wants to get in there and mine the heck out of it, but it involves mining in wetlands, which is think most people know is I'm not sure if this is, I'm gonna get my mouth closer, is a wonderful carbon sink. And the capacity to damage that in the name of getting the minerals just seems crazy. I don't know how much you came across those competing interests and how they get resolved.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that specific project, but you're absolutely right. There's tons of metal. I mean, Ontario already does lots of mining. They have lots of critical metals. They want to mine lots more of them. And like I say, I mean, that's going to cause some harm. There's no getting around it. And, you know, I think part of it is you've really, it's something you've got to look at really on a case-by-case basis because, I mean, I feel like just too often, you know, folks like us who are concerned about climate change and we're concerned about the environment, our first impulse is always just to say no mine, right? Mines are bad. They're going to tear up the wetlands. They're going to cut down the forest. They're going to poison the rivers. And yeah, they're probably going to do those things. But at the same time, again, the biggest threat is climate change, and we cannot stave off climate change without getting our hands on more metals. So there are some trade-offs that are going to have to be made, and I'm not saying that means go ahead and dig up the wetlands. I am saying, you know, we've got to accept that there is a price to be paid. But I hope we can talk about other ways to get metals besides mining.
I promise. I mean, one of the things I love about this book is because it's like my show. You present the issues and the problems, and then you come to the solutions. So don't worry, we're going to get there. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce it correctly, Atacama, where they boast that they are doing things in a better way.
Yeah, so the Atacama Desert, that's a really interesting case. So this is a region in northern Chile, which has the biggest lithium reserves in the world. Lithium, yet another ingredient in all of our batteries. All batteries have lithium in them. And there the issue is they come from it's called a desert. And the issue there is that the mining process takes a lot of water. And people are really concerned that they're drying out what little water there is in the desert. It's not totally dead. There are these rare flamingos that live there. There are these amazing lagoons that form on the surface of you know, in the hard pan, basically. These flamingos, there's wild birds. And again, there's indigenous communities that have been there for probably at least 12,000 years. All those things are being put at risk. Now, on the flip side, what the folks mining that lithium will tell you is the way that they extract it is it's actually brines. It's not hard rock mining. They're not chipping it out of rock. Rather, they're pulling up, there's this water, this super, super salty underground water that's full of minerals, including lithium. They pull it up to the surface and just let it evaporate under the sun, and then you're left with this kind of slurry that you can pull lithium out of. So there's very little machinery involved. It's very low carbon, very low polluting. You know, in some ways, it's a really good way to get lithium. But at the same time,
there's always a but.
There's always a but, right? There's always these trade-offs. Because the other way to get lithium is traditional hard rock mining, which is also like we also get a lot of lithium from Australia, where it's the usual story of gigantic diesel-powered machines smashing away at rock and bashing it down and spewing out carbon emissions and all that. That's another way to get lithium. So, you know, the way that they're doing it there, okay, they're not imperiling indigenous communities, but they're putting out way more carbon. Which one's better? You know, it's hard to say. I mean, you've got to, again, you can't say that any one, like they all have costs. There are always costs with all these things. And the trick is to find the sort of the lowest cost way to do it. And ultimately, well, we'll get back to this, but ultimately, how can we just like lessen our need for mining across the board?
Yeah. That is the big question at the end. You also write about, oops, somebody's cell phone. Shh. It's okay. You also write about a company that's registered here in Vancouver. I'm not sure how much of a relationship it actually has to the city, but that is angling to mine below the waves for these minerals. So tell us about that.
Yeah, They want to strip mine the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. What could go wrong, right? So once again, there are huge amounts of these metals on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean and in a bunch of other places. Billions and billions of dollars worth of this stuff. And we've known about that for a long time. And there are a bunch of companies and governments that are just champing at the bit to get their hands on this stuff, to get down there and do it. And right at the forefront of the pack is a company with the extremely unimaginative name of The Metals Company. They are theoretically headquartered here in Vancouver. Actually, they have zero connection to Vancouver or Canada. None of their executives live here. None of their operations are here. It's just basically because this is a good place to get investment dollars.
Wasn't there some sort of technology that was involved in at the very beginning that they were taking advantage of here? Or no?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't think so. Not this particular.
You wrote
company.
the book. I'll stop that. Go ahead.
Listen, fact check me all you want, please. You know.
You're not Trump. I don't have to do that.
Thanks. That's the nicest thing anybody's
Yeah.
I've heard all night.
You're welcome.
Anyway, so these guys have it's a privately owned company, and they have developed robots, these giant, robots about the size of this room, and they've tested the robots. They've dropped them down to the bottom of the Pacific, scooped up a whole bunch of these nodules, shot them up a big, like a 4-mile-long pipe up to their ship on the surface. So they're ready to go, man. Like they've proved they've got the robots that can do this. They've got the ships to do it. They've got all the technology in place. The only thing that is stopping them at this point is international law. Basically, under international law, nobody is allowed to industrial scale mining on the bottom of the ocean. That is down to one obscure United Nations agency that has the power to say yes or no to deep sea mining. So far, they have said no, but they're under a lot of pressure to turn that red light into a green light. You'll never guess who thinks deep sea mining is a great idea. Donald Trump, once again, yep. So there's a lot of pressure on these guys to basically allow it to happen. And this agency, it's called the International Seabed Authority. They meet a couple of times a year, and every time that they meet, they basically have the opportunity to flip from red to green. So that's really something to keep an eye on. I mean, they're meeting again in a couple of months. It's probably not going to happen at this next meeting, but it could very well happen, this year or next year.
But the owner makes the argument that this would save us from having to destroy land to mine, and it would be much better to suck up these amazingly rich nodules. Better for us to do that than do traditional mining.
Yeah, again, and he's got a certain point, right? Because indeed, he says, like, we can do this. No indigenous communities are going to be displaced. We're not going to poison anybody's drinking water. Like, there's all these benefits. And the only downside is we might, destroy the entire ocean ecosystem. But, but that's a risk we're willing to take, says he.
Yes, I've interviewed him.
Oh, yeah?
Yes, he's quite assertive
Yeah.
about what he's doing.
He's good, man. He's a very smooth talker. He knows his stuff.
So I'd like to stay in Vancouver for the moment, but this next part is actually really in Vancouver. I want you to tell me about someone you met here and wrote about, who is, I guess, in a small way, part of the solution. His name is Steve Nelson. Tell us about him.
Yeah, so this is, okay, good. Now we're finally getting to the how to do it better part of the book. So, part of it is we need to do more recycling, right? So I was like, that's what everybody says. Any environmentalist you talk to will tell you recycling's the answer. And I was like, yeah, recycling's good. What does that mean, though, when you talk about metal recycling? Well, come to find out, part of the answer is scrappers, like this guy, Steve, that I hung out with. And he's a guy who rides around on a bicycle through the back alleys of industrial Vancouver, like around, Clark Avenue, sort of where all those warehouses and factories are. He literally goes through the dumpsters outside of those places, just pulling out anything that's got metal in it. Old toasters, light fixtures, bits of old pipe, wire, anything that's got metal. And he's been doing this for 20 years. He can just look at, a length of wire and be like, oh yeah, that's gonna have about 6-7 pounds of copper, and the price of copper today is, $2.50. Oh, great, I'll get $15 for that. Oh, here's an old light fixture that'll have some aluminum in it and, some nickel in the, super entrepreneurial guy. And this is how he makes his living. He's been doing it for, like I said, for more than 20 years. He's got a little trailer on his bike, and he goes around and he collects up all this metal, takes it back to his little one-room apartment, sorts it, separates it out, breaks it apart, and then takes it to recycling yards. I was so impressed with this guy. He's basically like, the folks that you see pushing shopping carts full of old bottles and cans and stuff. He started out doing that, and he realized there was more money to be made scrapping. He's had a really hard life, this guy. He's, just barely, above street living. He was homeless for many, many years, but he figured out this niche. And I just, what he's doing is, it's just so ingenious. He's really hardworking, and he's not the only one, right? There are thousands of people like him all over in basically every city in this country and in the US. And they're also doing the rest of us a big favor, right? This is one face of recycling. This is a guy keeping trash out of landfills, getting more metal into the recycling stream so that we don't have to mine quite as much.
Does he realize that he's helping as much as he's making a living?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So he's at the very bottom of the chain when it comes to recycling this kind of metal, right?
Yeah.
You trace it all the way up, and it's quite astounding what's going on.
Yeah, it blew my mind. I had no idea. I mean, I was like, all I knew about recycling was, I put my bottles and my cans in the blue bin, and I stick it outside, and a truck comes and hauls it away, and I'm a hero, right? I've just recycled. But especially when you're talking about metal again, it is so much more complicated than that. So basically, Steve and guys like him take their bits and pieces to scrap yards. And there's a bunch of scrap yards here in Vancouver, usually pretty small mom and pop operations, and they'll gather together, sort of sort it, separate out, break apart the zinc from the lead, from the aluminum, and then they sell it to bigger scrap yards that are out, in places like, Surrey, sort of more like, kind of suburban, rural places. Those guys don't really recycle the metal either. Everybody involved calls themselves a recycler. None of them are actually doing the recycling. There's almost zero metal recycling happening in Canada anymore. What happens is it gets, sort of moved along this chain, bigger and bigger and bigger aggregators, and then it all gets put on a ship and sent, can you guess where? China. Yeah. That's where the recycling really happens, where they take the metal, melt it down, turn it back into reusable metal, and then sell it back to us again. So once again, this is it's a heavy industry, because recycling also turns out to have some really serious downsides, right? It's very energy intensive, it's very polluting, and it's often done on the backs of the poorest people in the world. And for all those reasons, it was yet another industry that we basically offshored, and that China said, great, we'll take this.
And I did want you to talk some more about how that happens in Africa, but we're already getting close on time, and I want to give you some time.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm talking too much, sorry.
No, it's okay. I want to give people a chance to ask questions, but I do want you to talk about where you end up in the book, which is, we did talk about recycling. There's also reuse, which is right to repair, which is something that everybody should be thinking about, extending the life of things so they don't have to be recycled. But you have a much bigger idea about dropping the need for all of these metals, things that we can do in our communities that would make a huge difference.
Yeah, so the number one thing that I always say that we as individuals can do to make a difference on all these issues that I'm talking about is, if it's at all possible, don't buy a car, not even an electric one. I love Vancouver. I see so many heads nodding. Like, yeah, it's a good idea. A lot of people I tell that to are just like, what? That's crazy. So, I mean, I won't go into the whole spiel too much because it seems like you guys basically get it, but cars are by far the most energy intensive, the most resource intensive things that most of us own, except for your house, if you're lucky enough to own a house, right? So if we can reduce, not get rid of, I'm not saying cars are evil, right? But if we can reduce the number of cars that are out there, that will really make a dent in the amount of metals that we need, which means we don't need to do as much mining all the way along the chain. Because basically there's already 1.2 billion cars on the roads worldwide, gasoline-powered cars. And if we swap all of them even for electric vehicles, we're just going to be swapping one set of problems for another. So we do much better off. Like, yes, electric cars, better than gasoline-powered cars, but better still, if you can, ride a bike, take public transit, walk, use Evo. That's how I got down here tonight. Evo is such a great system. I can't believe it. Yeah, that is the best way to really make a difference on all these issues.
What about electric bikes?
Electric bikes also great. Yeah.
That's good for where you're trying to get up hills in North Vancouver
Amen. Amen.
where I live. So that is great. It also demands, though, that political leaders invest in things like roadways that are friendly for that kind of thing and better public transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'll tell you, I mean, I'm so proud of this city for that. I mean, I grew up here, and then I moved away. I went to college in the States, and I moved away. I lived overseas and all kinds of stuff. I was gone for like 35 years, and I just moved back with my family about 5 years ago. And man, they've done so much to build up bicycling infrastructure. There's bike-safe streets everywhere. There's a great network. We've got the SkyTrain now. We've got the Evo. We've got walkable neighborhoods. Vancouver has done so much to become a place where you don't need a car. I always tell people this, I used to live in Los Angeles, and of course, me and my wife, our 2 kids, we had 2 cars there. We had to. As soon as we moved here, we got rid of one of those cars because we just don't need it here. And most of the time, that one car doesn't even go anywhere. So I'm really proud of Vancouver, and I think there's, it's a real great lesson for basically other cities everywhere.
Congestion charging might help.
Yes, absolutely.
Although that would be a hard one. Okay, I'm going to open it up. And as we said before, please no statements, just questions, because if you start going on, I'm going to cut you off. Okay? All right, go ahead.
Yeah, the part of the Pacific where all the nodules that are full of metals are, yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to say it into the mic for the recording purposes. The question is about whether Vince thinks that harvesting those nodules from the ocean floor would be worth it for what they have, or too much would be lost.
Yeah. My feeling is it's possible that on balance it might be easier on the planet. Oh man, there's some cell phone shaming happening around here. But it's just, at this point, it's just not worth the risk. We just don't know. I mean, the oceans are absolutely essential for all life on this planet, and the oceans are already super stressed from climate change, from pollution, from overfishing. They're really already, close to the red zone. So I don't think it makes any sense to add another potentially huge stressor onto them. At least not until we have a much clearer idea of what that'll mean, which means much, much, much more research.
It's been fascinating to see what they're turning up now as they're actually doing the research down there too. The creatures that they never knew existed. There's all sorts of reasons to wait and learn. Okay, you, sir.
Another recycling question. Do you think it's possible
Do you think it is possible to properly recycle all the millions of devices we have with all the metals in them?
Yeah, I do, actually. I mean, you know, technically there's no reason why not. Like the technology exists. These things do get recycled. Millions of them are recycled every year. What we really need is a better system of collecting them, right? So, I mean, we didn't get to talk about this, but I spent some time in Lagos, Nigeria, the biggest city in Africa, with e-waste scrappers there. Basically, folks doing the same thing that Steve Nelson does here, but with digital goodies, right? And these are guys who like just sit around all day, every day with old cell phones, cracking them open like hammers, cracking them open like walnuts with hammers, and pulling out the little bits of metal inside of them. Nobody will do that here because it's not worth it. Because what you get, you know, you get maybe 10 cents worth of metal out of them. People will do it in Nigeria because 10 cents goes a long way. If you can make $2, you're making the minimum, you're making a living wage, right? So somehow we have to we've got to shift the incentives so that it pays to recycle, so that people have an incentive to go around and collect this stuff and bring it into recyclers. And that's doable, right? The reason that you don't see beer cans or bottles anywhere is because of a government program, because of the deposit program, right? Every time you buy a 6-pack of beer, you're paying an extra, whatever it is, 60 cents or $1.20, and there's a deposit on that, and therefore, you know, people who are hard up are going all over town, grabbing those bottles and bringing them back. Well, there's no reason we can't do something similar with our electronics. Basically, like set up some kind of a system where people are incentivized, you know, to gather up old electronics. Now the problem is there's no incentive, right? It's a hassle. If your cell phone dies, what do you do with it? Like, I don't know, like, yeah, you can take it to Best Buy, maybe your church has a recycling drive, but you got to remember, it's all on you, right? It's nothing but hassle for no reward. It ends up in your drawer, exactly.
Apparently there are just so many of these devices sitting in people's drawers.
Yeah, billions of dollars worth. So, but you know, basically we have to make it easy and worthwhile for people to recycle that stuff, and that's doable. That is doable.
Good question. Just lady here. Are those metals toxic when you recycle them and take them out?
Yeah, they can be, for sure. Yeah, like, I mean, it's not a good idea to, you know, break open a cell phone yourself and try to like, you know, winkle the bits of metal out of the circuit boards. No. But the way that it usually happens, the way that most electronics get recycled is they're dumped in a giant industrial shredder, right? It's just the intact cell phone goes into a machine that just rips it apart, and then they use chemical processes to separate out all the stuff. So yeah, don't try it at home, but do recycle your gadgets.
I will say, we were talking before because I had been to a dump, they considered a work site in Ghana years ago, where they were young boys smashing apart computers and lighting them on fire with burning tires to get at the metals that were in them, and the smoke was toxic and it was affecting all of them, and you've seen that kind of thing.
Same thing in Lagos, same thing all over the developing world, yeah.
This gentleman here. So let me make sure I got it right. In your research, did you see the relationship changing between developing countries and, developing countries and foreign companies, foreign governments who want to come in? Right. Who want to come in, especially with critical minerals involved?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I think that's a very smart play. And the Philippines is actually doing that. They have a lot of copper. They also have a lot of nickel. And I know that I think just like in the last month or two, they've started putting in regulations basically forcing companies to do more of the refining there, more of the value add. So Indonesia has done really well with that. So again, Indonesia is the world's biggest nickel producer. They didn't used to be, but they had these huge nickel reserves. They really courted foreign investment, especially from China. They got and so tons of money has poured in there, billions and billions and billions of dollars to open up nickel mines. But after a very short while, the Indonesian government said, okay, but you know what? You're not allowed to export raw nickel anymore. You can only export nickel if you refine it here. In other words, they forced these companies to not just mine it and extract it and then run off, but also to do the refining, which is a more value-added step. And they've said, the Indonesian government is like, they want to keep building that. They want to get all the way up until they're manufacturing the batteries themselves there. So I will say it's been an environmental catastrophe for Indonesia, like the amount of mining, and also these refineries are horrendously polluting. But from an economic standpoint, it's been great. They're really it's bringing in tons of money. It's bringing, a lot of their workforce is becoming much more highly skilled. It's really, from a development standpoint, it's a smart move. I mean, we know that in Canada too, right? We do this. It's so dumb what we do half the time, right? We just cut down our trees and send them over to the United States. They turn them into furniture, and then we buy the furniture back, right?
Well, how much refining happens here then?
Not that much. Not that much. Yeah, some, but not a ton. There's a big refinery here in BC in Trail, really big copper refinery, I think, and also they do
Copper zinc smelting, yeah.
And also in Quebec, there's a big copper refinery there, but not that much. People hate refineries. They're nasty, polluting, ugly things, but they got to be somewhere.
Okay. Sorry, sir. I think this gentleman in the back was before you.
Is that me? Yeah?
Yep.
Hi, Vince.
Hi.
Good to see you. Hi, Laura. Good to see you too. This was awesome. There's a few of us in here who are advisors to some government ministers.
Oh.
So
Which ones?
my question to you is, let's say we had the Minister of Natural Resources in the room, or the Minister of Mines.
Provincial or federal?
Both.
Let's bring them all.
Yeah, let's have them all here.
What would you say to them? Other than read your book, obviously.
Yes. Read my book and buy copies for all your staff. That's a really good question. I should have an answer for that. But I think I would say they know, these ministers are very well aware that there's a huge market for these critical metals and that we've got lots of them in Canada. I would say that they should, that the current policy, which is develop more, is a good one. Really think we should be open to some more mining in Canada, not just throw the floodgates open, but yeah, let's have, as responsible as possible mining. Let's have more of it here. Let's sell Canada to international investors as a place where you can get copper, nickel. We have all the critical metals, and if you buy them from a Canadian mine, it's going to be mined to a higher standard, higher labor standards, more respect for Indigenous people. We've got better product here, and so we should be allowing that. But obviously, we need to maintain those standards, right? Don't just throw open the floodgates. And also, again, I really let's think about ways that we can, capture more of that value chain, which is happening here in Canada, right? Saskatchewan's just opened up a rare earth refining facility. It's having some real problems, but I think that's the way to go, right? We need to it's very much to our advantage to get control of this stuff away from China, just sort of geopolitically speaking, and it's very much in our economic interests to build up more capacity here in Canada, especially now that we see we really can't depend on our quote-unquote friends to the south.
It's like ethical diamonds. That's what they marketed them as the Northwest Territories.
Absolutely.
This gentleman here.
Turn to the mining the ocean floor. Are we heading to a place where geopolitical conflict over claiming ownership of the floor is going to become an issue? Is Trump going to want to say everything between California and Hawaii is now part of the USA?
Okay, and I forgot to voice your question, sir, but it's too late, I guess. The question is about whether Vince thinks that there will be geopolitical conflict over the surface of the ocean, whether someone like a Trump would try to claim, I guess, or Trump would try to claim the ocean surface from here to kingdom come, so to speak.
Well, needless to say, you never know with Trump. Anything's possible. But there's at least now there's a legal regime that's set up. So they've already mapped out the whole area where they're nodules. They're like basically rocks full of metals, and that whole area has been mapped out and sort of platted out, just like any mining claim zone. And the way that it works is countries go to this UN agency, the International Seabed Authority, and say, we would like to get the claim to this area. And so there's a legal framework set up where you can claim this chunk, that chunk, the other chunk. So that's the way it works now. And in theory, even if the US decides to go for seabed mining, which they haven't really been involved in so far, they would have to go through that legal framework. You know, we'll see.
Like you said, nobody knows. Up here. Oh, sorry. I'm not sure. You're asking about whether industries are retooling. Can you just try that again? Okay. Okay. Okay, so are there opportunities to shift industries into critical metals, or find a way not to have to depend on them for the kinds of things that we need to do? Am I getting that right? Yeah, I have no ideas. Okay. Why not? No, okay, go ahead, Vince.
Yeah, for sure. I think recycling is probably the most the place where the most of that is happening. There's a lot of new investment money going into recycling for critical metals. It's often called urban mining, and in fact, Laura's going to be talking about that on one of her upcoming shows.
Yes, tune in.
Yeah. In fact, you want to talk about it a little bit?
Well, urban mining actually has a number of layers of meaning, which is what Steve was doing, but it can also be at a more industrial level, can also be you in your home mining for the metals that you have in your resources there. But there is a Department of Innovation and Urban Mining at UBC that I didn't know about until very recently, where there's a mining engineer from Poland who runs it and is constantly looking for the best, most efficient ways to be able to harvest those metals and to be able to bring them back into use. And the one thing I didn't tell you is that what I found really interesting is that the interest in this kind of urban mining among engineers who are trained as mining engineers has exploded. And they just started a first-year class for students interested in urban mining, and they never had this before. So that in itself is sort of an industry that may start to take over more and more as younger miners and engineers get trained up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not only, like you said, it's not just the sort of individual level household stuff, but also on an industrial level. So there's a startup in Ontario called Li-Cycle that's a battery recycling outfit that's gotten a lot of money. They've got some support from the government. Hello, ministers. And that kind of thing, I think, is really promising, because you can recycle this stuff. It just, it takes money, it takes technology, but there's definitely a lot of interest in that whole sector, not only here but in the U.S. The Biden administration actually was pouring money into all kinds of critical metal recycling, battery recycling, trying to recover metals from all kinds of things. Trump, of course, has said he's going to gut all of those programs, so we'll see. But definitely, like, big picture, the whole recycling sector is growing, and I think it's going to grow a lot more. It's, technology can really help. It's a place where AI might really be able to help. So that's a place where I'm actually pretty optimistic.
Okay, we've got time for one last quick question.
Recycling automobiles, catalytic converters, yes, but they're so big and heavy. How much is that?
I have to say it into the microphone. How much of recycling automobiles is done?
A lot, actually. Yeah, the car, it's a really fascinating story. I talk about it a little bit in the book. Back in the 60s, junk cars were considered one of the biggest environmental problems in the United States. Like, the president talked about it. There was all these ads about it. There was cars just littering the roadways all over the place. And basically, it was fixed by a technological innovation. This guy came up with a sort of, basically like a small, affordable compactor. This way, the thing that like any scrap, like a junkyard dealer could afford, that just squashes cars down into a pancake and makes them really easy to recycle. So almost all cars get recycled, at least in North America. It's a pretty amazing story. And again, it's something that really gives me hope, because it just says, like, part of the solution can be, like, these problems that just seem impossible. Sometimes technology, like just a one technological breakthrough, can really flip the script completely.
All right, you guys have had great questions. One of the best sessions I've ever had for the questions that are being asked here, so good on you. And now, just remember, Vince has all of the answers that you need in that book. So you're going to go straight over there and buy one of his books, and Vince is going to sign them, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay, can we all just thank Vince for
And Laura.
his appearance?